Hi, Travis Tjepkema, President, Church Casualty Insurance Agency. Happy to have you here with us. And Matthew Boomhower. He is founder and president of Southern Cross Property Consultants. It's not often that you have both an architect and an attorney combined into one, but we're fortunate to have Matthew with us here today. And he also teaches real estate development at UC San Diego, and he's also a City of San Diego Planning Commissioner. And on top of it all, he's a pastor's kid. So he gets houses of worship, he understands how they operate, and he's a great resource, and we're just thankful to have you here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. 21 years doing this, the founder of this, San Diego and Orange County offices, primarily Southern California, but a lot of knowledge in the house of worship space and regarding property. And so I wanted to just jump in and talk about some different topics, and one being that you mentioned that maintenance is about stewardship. Expand upon that.
Well, I think it's important to understand that when we talk about doing maintenance at houses of worship, we're standing on the shoulders of previous generations. And so we've got buildings that were gifted to us by church founders or by subsequent generations, maybe even by us, where we've donated to capital campaigns. But the expectation with all of that is that we're going to wisely manage and use those facilities for worship and for ministry. And so for me, there's a baseline expectation that we're obligated to actually sit there and maintain these facilities because we're stewarding other people's gifts and using that to expand our ministry, expand our reach, to be able to do the things that frankly we've been called to do as church.
Yeah, good. That's a great point. You talked about speaking on stewardship. You talked about bad stewardship. And bad stewardship can look like emergency or deferred maintenance. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, and there's a fallacy in church circles that you're being a good steward if you're really not spending money. And I mean, I'm with you. The pastor shouldn't necessarily be driving a brand new Rolls Royce, and you shouldn't give out, the goal is to, again, advance the mission of the church. And so if by doing bad stewardship, what you're doing is allowing a maintenance backlog to build up so that you're essentially running it until it breaks, and then everybody's running around like a chicken with their head cut off going, oh, now what do we do? There's a leak, or this somebody fell down these stairs because the handrail fell off. That, like, none of those really advance the mission or the ministry. And so for me, it's really sitting there and saying, look, like, again, you should be being proactive and staying on top of these things, because not spending money, it's pay me now, pay me later. And when you pay me later, it's going to be a lot more expensive. It's going to pull away from other ministries or other needs or other things that you're trying to do.
That was another thing you had down here too, regarding emergency repairs. When it comes to emergency, things get more expensive. Talk about that. The things that an emergency that you didn't prepare for, the ripple effect of that.
Sure. I mean, we always talk about it as just think about your emergency cost as being 4 times what you would pay if it was a non-emergent issue. So if you need to call a plumber out and you can take all the time in the world and you can work with their schedule and they can come out during normal working hours, there's going to be a cost for that. $100, $150, whatever the cost is for them to come and make the repair. If you wait until the pipe bursts and it's 3 a.m. on Christmas Eve, and you're like everything's going to cost more. Now that's an extreme example, but I mean, the reality is that if you don't, let's take roof maintenance, for example. We just got a bunch of rain in Southern California, it's kind of unseasonably. But I mean, the reality is, if you have a roof leak because you've not been taking care of your roof, it's not just going to be the cost of fixing the roof leak. It's going to be then the cost of the water damage inside, maybe abatement of mold or anything else that's been caused because of that roof leak. And so really you're sitting there and saying, okay, like if I want to have as much control over the situation as possible, then I need to be proactive in how I'm doing maintenance. Because if I'm waiting until it breaks and I'm waiting until it's an emergency, I'm giving up all of that control, and it's just more costly. It's not as effective.
When you said roof leaks, it made me think of windshield wipers. And it's like nobody in Southern California knows they need windshield wipers until it rains.
Exactly.
And so about that maintenance, kind of along that line, you talk about, we've chatted about in the past about ages of roofs, and you brought up a good point about it's not so much the age of the roof, it's the maintenance of the roof.
Exactly.
So ongoing maintenance and making sure that you're maintaining these things to avoid those emergency situations.
Yeah, I mean, every manufacturer assumes that you're going to be doing some maintenance for a product. So if you go out and you buy a roof with a 30-year warranty on it, and the projection on it is, yep, you should get more than 30 years worth of life out of this roof. The assumption by the manufacturer, and it's not just an assumption, they tell you this, but most people don't read it, is you're going to be doing annual maintenance on that roof. And the roof surface itself is going to be great, but all of the penetrations, all of the flashings and things around it, any place that you've got like a sealant around a pipe penetration or a vent, those aren't going to last 30 years. Those are that sealant's probably good. It needs to be replaced every 16 to 18 months because it degrades under ultraviolet exposure. And so depending on where you are, I mean, if you're closer to the coast, now, yeah, you don't have as much sun part of the year, but you've got all that salt exposure that's going to dry it out. Same thing with if you're inland and you've got the sunshine all the time, it's just baking in the sun. But the common denominator is you've got to be doing the maintenance and you've got to be keeping up with that.
Very good. Let's talk about, I think one thing that was surprising to me, not, I guess, surprising, but definitely something that is not talked about enough is the fiduciary duty. And the board members of a church or a house of worship that recognize it's a nonprofit, and talk a little bit about that and their duty as far as, and how maintenance ties into that as well.
Sure. So now's when I throw out my whole, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. But
right.
In general, how this works is, and a lot of churches lose sight of this. We all know that we're a nonprofit. Well, in California, you're a nonprofit because you're a nonprofit corporation. But even as a nonprofit corporation, you still fall under the Corporations Code, the California Corporations Code. And the California Corporations Code doesn't care if you're a nonprofit or a for-profit company or corporation. Their expectation is that the board of directors is going to follow the regulations as laid out in the Corporations Code. Well, the board for your church is the board of directors for the corporation.
Right.
And one of the base expectations in the Corporation Code is that every director has a fiduciary obligation to the corporation, which means they have to sit there and actually make decisions that are in the best interest of that corporation. And if they deviate from that, then they can actually take on individual liability, not just liability to the organization, but they could actually lose their protections under the good faith rules and under the officers and directors, insurance policy, those types of things.
Yeah, we refer to it often as due diligence. You got to use your due diligence as a board member, and maintenance is part of that.
Exactly. Well, and the Corporations Code is pretty clear too. It gives volunteer board members, in this case at a church, a really solid protection, which is the good business judgment rule. And what the business judgment rule says is that you don't have to be an expert. But what you need to do is bring in experts to fill in the areas where you don't have the expertise that would be required. And so like for property facilities management, something that we're involved with, that would be bringing in someone like us or an architect or an engineer to actually look at a problem and then make recommendations to your board about the best way to do something. As opposed to just, oh yeah, we just think we want to do this.
I had my cousin Johnny looked at it. He said it looked good.
Yeah,
don't do that. That's not due diligence. Well, bring in a consultant, bring in an expert, bring in somebody. You don't have, like you said, you don't have to be the expert, but you have to have the due diligence as a board member to know that you need to bring in the proper personnel for the property maintenance of your facilities.
Right. I refer to it as the I've got a guy syndrome.
Right.
Just because you had somebody that did a great job renovating the bathroom at your house doesn't mean that they're the contractor that has the right qualifications to come in and do a bigger project at your church. And so, due diligence is not just who are you talking to, but it's also making sure that like you're actually bringing in the right people in the right situations.
Right. Yeah, bringing in the experts. That maybe you brought up the water shutoff valve. I have a challenge for everybody listening to this. Do you know where the water shutoff valve is at your facilities? I'd be surprised if, and then at your own home. Sometimes I forget. I have to remember where it is. But it's good to know.
Well, and not only do you need to know where it is, but you actually need to once a year actually go out and twist it and turn it off and make sure that
that it can still move in two different directions.
Exactly.
Good,
yeah.
solid point. Solid point.
I've seen too many times when somebody's out there and they're like, okay, I know where the meter or the valve is, and then they go to shut it off and they snap the handle off. It just won't move.
Yeah, very solid point. Yeah, you don't want to try to become Incredible Hulk when water's flowing everywhere. Yeah.
Not a good plan.
Not a good plan at all. Talk about, you told a great story earlier about roof replacement and a church donor and kind of deferred maintenance in that regard. I like that story really hit home. If you could share that.
Sure. So I won't tell you specifically who the church was, but this is one of our church clients. And like a lot of churches that were kind of built out in that post-war period, their buildings were built in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and then they were doing maintenance on them. And so we'd gotten brought in and we're doing some consulting with them, trying to help them figure out what were their maintenance issues, where were their big ticket items, how do we prioritize those? And it turned into a little bit of a, how do you pick your favorite kid? Because it was like, well, you've got a lot of issues, but obviously limited dollars. So even though these are all bad, we have to start kind of picking and choosing what things we're going to spend time and money on first. We'd identified that they had a roof that had some issues. We'd made some recommendations to them about what to do. It got bumped a little further down the priority list. And then unfortunately there was a big rainstorm and that roof leaked in a pretty significant way. Did a bunch of damage. It was a multi-story building, 2 floors worth of damage, a lot of stuff going on. So the church was in this really bad position because they're sitting there and now this is obviously not something they've budgeted for. And so they're trying to figure out, well, where are we going to take and pull resources from? What are we going to do? And what they ultimately decided was they'd been saving the money and budgeting to call a part-time youth pastor. And they'd had the money in place for salary and benefits to have a part-time person for 2 years. And they were like, well, that's almost exactly what it's going to cost for us to make this fix. So we're just going to have to defer calling this youth pastor. The part you're commenting on, though, is the fact that led to a very uncomfortable conversation that the pastor and the leadership for this church had to have with the lead donor, who had actually very specifically given a big gift towards calling this youth pastor. And they actually had to go to them and say, hey, what would you like to do? Would you like your money back? Would you like, how, because we can't obviously use money that was given to us for this purpose, for this other purpose. So what would you like? Happy ending on that story is the donor was incredibly generous and said, you know what, let's go ahead and use the money and fix the roof, and then I will commit that I will, at whatever point we move forward with the youth pastor, we'll still contribute money to that as well. But these stories don't always have a happy ending, like that. And so again, you just have to, if you, like a lot of churches say, well, I'll just deal with it when it breaks, then you really put yourself in a position where it can take away from being able to do ministry and do the business of being a church.
And on that note, budgeting wise, when to replace, you had a good analogy of working backwards. So if you could talk a little bit about that, about how you work backwards when you're thinking about, okay, we're going to budget to replace this and the things you have to consider.
Sure. So we've been picking on roofs, but let's just stick with that theme. So if you've determined that you've got a roof that's going to need to be replaced in, let's say, 2 years, then what you need to do is actually start working backwards from there. And so, okay, fine, the roof needs to be replaced in 2 years. So what that means is that we need to actually have selected a contractor and have a contract in place, which means I'll have to get my board to sign off on that. That's going to have to happen in, let's call it 18 months,
okay.
In order for us to have time to put all that in place, which means that then I have to sit there and think, okay, well, if I know this needs to be replaced in 24 months and I want to get it done before it fails, that's my 18 months, then I need to back up because my board only meets once a month. So I probably need to back up 3 months so I can make sure that we have the bids,
right.
We can get onto an agenda, we can get this approved, and we can get this work on somebody's schedule to be done before we hit that 18 months. So we still have that 6-month buffer before we reach the failure point. But then you got to sit there and say, okay, well, gosh, if I have to have this in front of my board now in, 15 months, then how long is it going to take me to get those bids? So now I'm back, 2 to 3 months ahead of that. And then if I'm sitting there and saying, well, one of the questions my board is going to ask when I put this in front of them is how are we going to pay for this? Then I really need to start actually thinking about how I'm going to budget for this now so that I can get it into for sure next year's budget cycle, but if at all possible, some money into this year's budget cycle so that we're beginning to set that money aside so that we have it by the time we get there. So, I mean, I always tell people you when you're thinking about this stuff, especially for big ticket items, you've got to be playing chess, not checkers. Checkers, you can think one move ahead, you're fine.
Right.
But in chess, if you're going to be successful, you got to be thinking 3 and 4 moves down the road.
Right.
And that's where this really starts to become very strategic.
I think a lot of times you can get lost in the amount. It's not just the money; it's the timeline, right? It's obviously both. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And then talk a little bit about you brought up tenants, which I don't think is often talked about. Do you have houses of worship that have tenants? Who's responsible for what?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the failings I see, and I'll sort of throw my lawyer hat on for a second, but I mean, like anytime you have tenants, you should have a lease with them, even if it's another affiliated church organization that's using space.
Yeah.
You still need to have some kind of written document that just spells out who's doing what to whom, who's responsible for which things, that kind of thing. I mean, that's just a good best practice. But then you need to take that one step further and really think about, okay, if we have, say you've got a preschool that is an affiliated ministry, but it's in your space, or a church school or something like that. Are they responsible for their own maintenance? Are you responsible for your maintenance?
Right.
Who's responsible for ensuring their contents? Who's responsible for ensuring the building? I mean, it's easy to sit there and say, oh, well, they're going to have their own insurance. And they may. And they may even say, yeah, no, we've got our own insurance. But they're thinking about the insurance to cover their employees, their workers' comp, their, their health benefits, those kinds of things. They're probably not thinking about the fact that they've got, I mean, even a small preschool could have $20,000 or $30,000 worth of computer equipment and toys and stuff.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And if that's not covered in the church's insurance policy and they don't have it covered in their policy and there's a loss, well, now it's an uninsured loss and somebody's out of pocket for it.
Right. Yeah, and it's definitely, obviously, contracts every time. I'm full agreement with that. Not an attorney, so I can just say that freely.
Well, I am an attorney, and I'll tell people, I mean, a verbal agreement is legally enforceable in California, but it's impossible to prove.
Right.
And so the challenge is always, look, you've got to make sure that you're like, don't worry about who's agreeing to it today. When 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you're trying to go back and look at this and say, well, who's responsible for this?
Right.
Having something that lays that out initially and make sure that everybody's got it just becomes useful because, I mean, time passes and people move on or forget or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's the liability is there, and like, give me your proof of liability, give me your proof of you have your own personal contents covered as a tenant. The third piece, though, which I think is a very important, right, is like let's make sure that if you're using a large chunk of our buildings, okay, who's going to be responsible for it? Let's spell that out, and take care of that, and keep an eye on it, obviously, as a landlord. So,
well, yeah, I mean, it's always the trust but verify, but but if you're just assuming it's happening, assume it's not.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. Very good point. Okay, and then you talked about best practices. Three things: fresh eyes, can't read my writing, campus inventory,
Yep.
and cost assumptions. So let's talk about those three things: fresh eyes, campus inventory, and cost assumptions.
See, I love how you're putting me on the spot and making me remember that I have to go through each of these things. Hi, I have one question for you, but it's in 37 points.
All right, let's talk about one at a time then. Fresh eyes. Let's talk about that.
So fresh eyes, it's just simply this. You and just think about this in your own life.
Yeah.
You've got a to-do list. You've got projects around the house that you know you need to get to,
Right.
and at a certain point, it just either because of our natural tendency to avoid doing things that we don't want to do, or just because something fades into the background. Oh yeah, I know that door squeaks and I need to fix it, but I don't have the tools with me and I'm running out the door right now. I'll get to it later. So one of the advantages of bringing in someone from the outside that's new to your church campus is that you can actually use them to look around. One of the things I do every time I go to a church campus for the first time is check their signage. Can I figure out where I'm supposed to go, how I'm supposed to get there? Because it's going to be the only time I'm ever on this campus where I've not got a single blessed clue where I'm going.
Right.
It's kind of the same concept. It's sitting there and saying, hey, let's bring in somebody, whether it's an outside consultant or your insurance broker or somebody, a friend of yours from another church, somebody that can come in and actually sit there and just look at things and say, well, okay, well, what about this? Or, okay, who's responsible for fixing this thing over here? And it just makes it so much easier because you've got somebody that doesn't know the backstory or the history, or that just doesn't, yeah, I know it's on my list, but it keeps getting moved further and further down with other priorities. So, I mean, that's kind of what we mean when we sit there and talk about, hey, let's look at this with fresh eyes, or let's bring in somebody that can lay fresh eyes on this problem.
Well, and I think it's like you're so used to your own properties that you mentioned look up, look around. I think that just to look up, people, you'll go into a facility and people that haven't looked at it's like you don't go into a room to look at the ceiling or to look at the roof,
Exactly.
So it's just a matter of having that fresh set of eyes, kind of like, oh, have you ever noticed this?
My wife and I have been married for a very long time now, and she's gotten over this, but for years she would just shake her head because I'd walk into a space, I'd walk past a fire extinguisher and I'd be looking to see if it was charged, or I'd walk into a space I hadn't been in and I'd be looking up at the ceiling and going, oh look, they got a water leak over there. And I mean, she's so used to it now that she doesn't even think about it, but it's occupational hazard.
Yeah.
But most people don't do
No.
that. That's not how we experience buildings.
See, I have the total reverse relationship in my house. I don't notice anything, and my wife notices everything that needs to be fixed. And then she reminds me. And so,
marriage is a partnership.
It's a partnership,
exactly.
So you just balance out your strengths and weaknesses. There you go. All right. Second one was campus inventory.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you can't plan for what you don't know about. And so for me, and look, I'm a control freak. You said it already. I'm an architect. I'm an attorney.
I did not say you were a control freak. I said those two
no,
things.
but I am those things. And both of those professions are known for being very, we draw a lot of control freaks in.
You're an attorney with good handwriting.
Well,
so that's a
yeah.
cool thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but one of the things that happens is that if you aren't sitting there and beginning to inventory out, especially your big ticket items, the things that don't require ongoing maintenance, then it's easy to forget about them until they break. Or until you suddenly go, oh, you know what? I don't think anybody's looked at that for a while. And so, I mean, here we're talking about, again, like roofs, obviously, things that are going to wear out pretty regularly, like carpeting in high traffic areas, those types of things. But it's also again, we did a lot of post-war building in Southern California. A lot of people were coming here that were not from California, so they were coming from back east where they built basements. For some reason, we built basements in all our buildings here. All those basements have sump pumps because they all have water issues.
Right.
When's the last time first of all, how many pumps do you have? And secondly, when's the last time anybody went around and checked them all?
Right.
Because when those stop working, it becomes even worse than if you didn't have a pump. So, it's just going through and trying to list those things out. I had a church that we were working with where we actually said to them, hey, how many HVAC units do you guys have on your campus? And they're like, oh, we have no idea. There's heating and air conditioning in each of our buildings. And it's like, great, but how many units? They didn't know. So we started actually inventorying it. We came back to them and we're like, yeah, you got 28 different heating units or cooling units. And they were blown away. They were like, yeah, if we would have thought maybe 8.
Yeah.
I mean, like we just didn't know.
Right.
Well, how can you comprehensively put together a maintenance program for that stuff if you just don't know it's there?
Right.
You know, and it becomes an important tool as well, because one of the challenges that a lot of churches have is we know statistically that most members of your congregation are coming to the church campus 3 to 5 hours a week. And there's this fallacy of presence that starts to happen where people are like, okay, well, I'm only on this church campus 3 to 5 hours a week, so surely this building's barely being used, and it's not deteriorating at the same level as if it was being used all the time. Well, first of all, most churches are being used all the time. They're just being used by different groups at different times. But secondly, it's like I said, it's just this fallacy that people start to buy into. And so if you're gonna try to be in a position where you're trying to educate people and say, hey, we actually need a plan for replacing our HVAC equipment, if you can sit there and say, and we have 28 different condensers or rooftop units or furnace units, or people are going to be like, oh my God, I had no idea we had that many. You're right. We should really start thinking about this.
Right.
But instead it's like, I don't know, I show up on Sunday, the lights are on, the candles are lit, the screens are lit. I mean, I'm good.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, very important. And to do that, talked about, simple as Excel spreadsheet, and just document it.
Yeah,
however you document, there's 1,000 ways to document it, but just make sure you're documenting.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not just like come up with the inventory and then you can start to build on that, and you can say, okay, I have a maintenance contract on this, and this is who's doing the maintenance on it, and this is how frequently they're coming out. And and then you can start to actually build some good data. I'm totally a data nerd.
Yeah.
I'm a nerd about many things, but I mean, data is my friend because I can actually use that. I can use it to sit there and make plans and to show people what they need to do. We can try to put together costs for it and say, hey, here's how you need to be thinking about this, and then you can rack and stack it with the rest of your priorities.
Great. And then the last is cost assumptions. And in today's world, just about, in our world, we talked about replacement cost and building cost and labor cost. And I was fascinated. You said since 2020, so in the last 3 years, we're talking a 25% increase, 20 to 25% increase.
Yeah, I was just in a presentation that was being given by a construction economist, and those were the numbers he was putting out there, and he had all the data to back it up. It was pretty interesting, and we all saw during the COVID pandemic that, and this was mostly a supply chain, you just couldn't get stuff, but we saw just massive cost escalation. Plywood was going up in price monthly. Same thing with lumber. That has moderated to a certain extent, but we're still seeing in Southern California really substantial cost escalation. When you think about the fact that the Fed is spending a lot of time in raising interest rates and trying to get inflation back down under 7.5% towards their 2% target. When we're talking about a construction cost inflation that's running 3 to almost 4 times that. Right. At 20 to 25%, that's a pretty significant increase. And so what that means is if you get a bid for something today and it's something you're not going to touch for a couple of years, then you really have to be thinking about, well, how much do I need to run that number up?
Right.
But the other one, which is what we were talking about before, is like for replacement cost,
right,
for buildings, when you're doing your insurance, you've got to go back and look at those numbers. And if you haven't updated them since 2020, you're going to be in for a rude awakening when you actually start looking at what it would cost to replace your building today. And so you've got to really think about that. And I was telling you the story about the church that hadn't updated their replacement values since sometime in the mid 1980s. That's an extreme example,
sure,
and I think that's just a failure on the part of their insurance broker and frankly their insurance carrier. But easy trap to fall into. And so I think you really have to be thinking about these things because we know costs have gone up a lot.
Right. Yeah, and you said something interesting too earlier about, because we talked about plywood and maybe how that's come back down, but the cost of these employers to keep staff and to keep workers, that's gone up as well. So that's passed along in the cost of labor and the cost of the construction.
Yeah, one of the things I always talk to my real estate development students about this, but I mean, we understand that like the construction and real estate industry is cyclical, and
Right.
it's up and then there's a recession and then it's up and it's down. And we've always known that, and we've always worked around that. And the industry kind of had a way of at least reaching an equilibrium. One of the things that happened that, many things were exacerbated by the pandemic. But if you think back to the Great Recession, 2008, 2010 timeframe, the construction industry lost 40% of our workforce. Just went away.
Wow.
Left the industry, went and found jobs elsewhere. And I mean, if you think about it, we fell off a cliff. It was
Everything stopped.
bad. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And it turns out we never got those people back. So if you actually look at construction employment numbers, they started climbing again, but they were climbing at the same growth rate that we had before we took a 40% cut. Well, fast forward from 2010 to 2020, and we get into the pandemic. Well, construction never stopped. In California, construction was an essential industry. There were precautions that were put in place, but the construction industry kept going. But all of a sudden, we began to just realize that we didn't have enough workforce for what was happening out there. And as everybody in the economy started to have a workforce retention problem, and you could suddenly find, you could go make $20 flipping burgers.
Right.
Well, turns out flipping burgers, not working in the hot sun on a roofing crew all day. If I'm just a low man on the totem pole laborer, and I'm making 15 or 16 bucks up on hot roofs all day, mopping asphalt, or I could go over here and flip burgers and be hot inside.
Right.
Why not go do that? And so we've seen a real challenge within the construction industry with just labor cost. It's been insane.
Yeah. Wow. And that drives everything else.
Everything else.
Absolutely. All right. Well, this has been great. We'll end on this one. The thing you talk to your students about, 80% of the decisions of a building. Why don't you finish that out?
So, it's a fun statistic, and it really blows people's minds, but it really gets into the fundamental idea that there's two types of costs when it comes to building. There's your upfront cost, and then there's your life cycle cost. And the best way to conceptualize that is with the statistic where, and this is rule of thumb, but with most building projects, 80% of the decisions about the building are made before construction starts. 80% of the costs of the building occur after construction is complete.
Right.
Because 80% of your costs are actually from operating and maintaining and replacing things in that building as they wear out over time. So, people think that, gosh, it's really expensive to build a building or to renovate a building, and it is, but that's 20% of the cost of that building over its life cycle. And so you really have to be careful as you're thinking and saying, okay, am I using a less expensive product today, but that's going to bite me down the road because I'm either going to replace it more often, or it's not going to operate as efficiently, or but those decisions are being made on the front end, and you're making those decisions. It kind of goes back to your stewardship thing that we started with.
Right.
You have to really be thinking from a stewardship standpoint of, okay, I can get this done today at this low price, but am I passing on a problem to my kids or my grandkids or future generations?
Yeah. It's like the excitement of building that children's building and raising the money for that fund. All the excitement's there, but nobody thinks about all the cost after the fact. It's one thing to build the building, it's whole other thing to maintain it.
Exactly.
So we have to have that same passion that we have to raise that money to build that new building. That same passion needs to be with dedicated people at the church to continue to maintain it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. Well, this has been great. Thanks for your time, Matthew.
happy
Really
to do
appreciate it. Where can people find you? What's the website?
So our website is www.southerncrosspc.com.
Okay, great. And you can find us at ccia.com. We have a webinar coming up November 1st. We'll get more news out on that with Eric Becker on a 2024 HR and law update. And then on November 2nd, we will have a Eric Spacek from Church Mutual Insurance Company talking about trends and claims that they're seeing around the nation, as well as risk management practices for your church. That'll be November 2nd in Costa Mesa at the Crossing Church, and more info on that will come out. Matthew, again, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
All right.